I took the job in October. That detail matters, I think, because October in that part of Pennsylvania is when the light starts doing strange things in the afternoon, going amber and sideways through the tree line so that shadows land in places that don't quite make sense relative to the sun. It's a detail I didn't think about at the time. I was too focused on the money. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm a surveyor. Was a surveyor, technically, before I moved into GIS work full-time, which is mostly desk work and doesn't pay as well as it sounds. In between those two phases of my career, there was a stretch of about 3 years where I took whatever contract work I could find: property boundary disputes for lawyers, wetland delineation for developers who needed someone to tell them the wetland wasn't really a wetland, topographic surveys for township road projects. That kind of thing. Unglamorous. Useful. It paid the mortgage on a house I was about to lose half of in a divorce I hadn't finished grieving. The mine job came through a guy named Rick Poljinsky, who ran a small environmental consulting firm out of Bethlehem. I'd done a few jobs for him before. Rick was the kind of person who sent emails at 2 in the morning and then acted confused when you hadn't replied by 7. He was also reliable in a specific way, meaning he paid on time and he didn't lie about what the work actually involved, which is rarer than it sounds in that industry. He called me on a Tuesday. I remember because I was eating cereal for dinner, which had become something of a habit since Karen moved out. "You still doing field work?" he asked. I told him I was. "I've got something weird. Good money, but weird. You want to hear it?" The short version was this. A mining company called Aldrich Resources had purchased an old anthracite mine in Carbon County, about 40 minutes west of Hazleton. The mine had been inactive since 1962 and had changed hands several times over the decades, passing through a series of holding companies and bankruptcy proceedings and tax forfeitures until Aldrich picked it up for what Rick called basically nothing. Aldrich's plan was to assess whether any coal remained worth extracting, but before they could do that, they needed complete documentation of the existing tunnel system. Whoever had owned the mine in the interim decades had done a lousy job of maintaining the records. A lot of the original survey data from the 50s was on paper that had degraded, and some of it was simply missing. So they need someone to go in and map everything, Rick said. Document what's there, update the coordinates, cross-reference with whatever old paper records survived. They've got some of those, apparently. The job would take a few weeks, maybe a month if the tunnels are in worse shape than the preliminary inspection suggested. When did the preliminary inspection happen? About 6 months ago. A mine safety engineer, just a visual assessment. He said the main shafts were structurally sound, some water infiltration in the lower levels, typical for that age and type. Nothing that would prevent the mapping work. I asked about the rate. Rick named a number. It was about 40% higher than my usual day rate for field work. "Why so much?" I said. He was quiet for a second. "Because it's underground, and nobody else wants to do it." That was honest enough. I said I'd think about it and call him back. I called him back in 4 minutes and said yes. The drive out there took me through some of the most depressed real estate in northeastern Pennsylvania, which is saying something. Carbon County had been coal country, and then it had been nothing, and the towns that were left over from the coal era had the quality of things that had been abandoned without anyone having the decency to tear them down. Storefronts with hand-lettered signs for businesses that had closed in the 90s. Frame houses with good bones and peeling paint. A diner outside of Tamaqua, where I stopped for coffee on my first morning, run by a woman in her 60s who refilled my cup without asking, and told me, unprompted, that she'd lived there her whole life and that most of the good people had left when the mines closed. "What kept you?" I asked. She shrugged. "Where would I go?" I thought about that for most of the drive. The mine property was off a state forest road that wasn't on most GPS systems. Rick had given me the coordinates, and I'd loaded them into my device, but the last 2 miles were on a gravel road that wasn't marked and that my truck handled badly. The property was posted with Aldrich Resources signs, orange and professional looking, incongruous against the scrubby oak and birch that had grown up around the old site. There was a gate, a new one, with a padlock, and I had the combination written on a post-it in my center console. The site itself was bigger than I'd expected. The main headframe was still standing, which surprised me. A lot of old anthracite operations had their headframes pulled for scrap decades ago, but this one was intact, a timber structure about 60 feet tall with a rusted sheave wheel at the top, the winding rope long since gone. Around it were the remnants of the surface facilities, the concrete foundations of the breaker building, a low brick structure that had been the lamp room and check-in station, two smaller outbuildings whose purposes I couldn't immediately identify. All of it was overgrown, birch saplings pushing up through the concrete cracks, but the bones of the place were solid. I had a site trailer, a small one Aldrich had arranged to have delivered, parked near the old lamp room. Inside was a folding table, a propane heater, a set of the surviving original mine maps, and a note from someone named Garrett Huff, who was listed on my contract as the company's on-site safety contact. The note said Garrett would be out on Friday to go over the safety protocols with me, that I should not enter the mine before that meeting, and that the padlock combination for the mine entrance cap was different from the gate combination and was in an envelope taped to the underside of the table. The envelope was there. I didn't open it. I had 4 days before Friday, so I spent them doing surface work. Surface work at an old mine site is its own kind of job. You're documenting what's there, which sounds simple until you realize that what's there is a palimpsest, layer over layer of construction and abandonment and construction again and abandonment again. The original operation had been sunk in 1891, according to the surviving records. The first 20 years were good ones, apparently. Then the coal started running thin in the upper levels and they went deeper. By the 30s, there were records of 3 levels below the original shaft, each with its own lateral tunnels branching off the main gangway. By the 40s, they were pumping out significant water. By the late 50s, the operation was clearly struggling. The records showing repeated equipment breakdowns and worker complaints, and at least 3 incidents that were logged as gas events, which in mining terminology means there was enough methane or carbon monoxide in the air that people got sick or equipment was damaged. The last entry in the operational log I had was dated April 9th, 1962. It was a routine entry about pump maintenance. Nothing in it suggested the mine was about to close. It just stopped. Whatever happened after that wasn't in the records Rick had given me. I spent those first 4 days walking the surface, running a total station survey of the existing structures, photographing everything, and getting familiar with the old maps. The maps were something. They'd been drawn by someone with real skill, probably a company surveyor from the early period, in ink on linen, and even with the degradation they were beautiful in a functional way, the tunnels rendered as precise black lines with distance annotations in a cramped but legible hand. The coordinate system was a local one, reference to a surface benchmark that was marked on the map with a small triangle and the notation BM#1. I found BM#1 on my second day. It was a brass disc set in a concrete monument near the headframe, half buried under decades of leaf litter. The disc was still readable. The elevation stamped into it was 1,247.3 feet. I shot it with my total station and confirmed the elevation to within about 1/10 of a foot, which given the age of the monument was good. This was useful because it meant I could use the old coordinate system as a starting point and convert to modern GPS coordinates once I had enough control points established. That part of the work was satisfying in the way that good technical problems are satisfying. Concrete, solvable, with clear right answers. I've always liked that about surveying. Reality is what it is, and your job is just to measure it accurately. There's no interpretation required. The tunnel is where the tunnel is. The wall is the distance from the center line that it is. You write it down, you move on. I was less comfortable with the parts of the record that were missing. According to the original maps, there were 4 main levels and 11 lateral galleries on those levels. But the maps I had only showed 3 levels in detail. The 4th level was sketched in, the lines thinner and less precise, with fewer annotations, as if whoever drew it had been working from memory or from notes rather than from direct measurement. And there were references in the operational logs to at least 2 tunnels that didn't appear on any map I had. One was called the Western Extension and was mentioned repeatedly in logs from 1957 and 1958 as being a focus of active mining. The other was referred to only as the Lower Heading, no further description, mentioned twice in 1961 and then never again. I made notes about these gaps in my initial site assessment report, which I emailed to Rick on Thursday evening. His reply came at 11:45 at night. Aldrich is aware of the gaps. That's part of why they hired you. Map what's there, document what's missing, get it all. Garrett Huff showed up Friday morning at 7:30, driving a company pickup with Aldrich logos on the doors. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 32, with the kind of build that suggested he'd played college football and then spent the intervening years in office chairs. He was cheerful in an aggressively professional way and carried a hard case that turned out to contain the mine safety equipment I'd need: a 4-gas monitor, a headlamp rated for underground use, a self-rescue device, and a radio that he said was compatible with the relay transponders that had been installed in the main shaft and the first 2 levels. "We put in 4 transponders," he said, spreading the equipment across my folding table. "Main shaft, level 1 main gangway, level 2 main gangway, and at the junction of the 2 longest laterals on level 2. Coverage gets thin past that. The monitor will alert you to methane, CO, CO2, and oxygen deficiency. If any alarm goes off, you stop work and come out. Don't try to diagnose it, don't try to push through. Come out." I told him I understood. "What's your underground experience?" he asked. I said I'd done some work in a limestone cave system in Kentucky about 8 years back, as part of a hydrological survey, and I'd been in a few smaller culvert and storm sewer systems for drainage surveys. Nothing like this. He nodded. Anthracite mines are different from caves. The tunnel geometry is more regular, which sounds like it would make navigation easier, but it actually makes it easier to get confused. All the intersections look alike. The company that did the preliminary inspection used colored flagging at the junctions, so you should see that. It'll help orient you. We also have the old trip markers. I asked what trip markers were. In the operational period, miners tracked which tunnels they were in using a system of numbered metal tags hung at each junction, some kind of accountability measure, so the mine boss could figure out where everyone was. A lot of old anthracite mines used some version of this. In this one, they used numbered aluminum discs hung on wire from a nail or a hook at each junction. The preliminary inspection found most of them still in place. They're not a navigation system by themselves, but cross-referenced with the original maps, they can help you figure out where you are. He handed me a laminated sheet. It was a simplified version of the original map, with the junction numbers annotated in red. 23 junctions total, numbered 1 through 23. "Some of these may be wrong," he said, tapping the sheet. "If the discs are in the wrong place, or if some are missing, document it and we'll sort it out. The main thing is to stay oriented. You should never be more than a few junctions from a known reference point. If you feel like you've lost track of where you are, stop moving and retrace." We went through the equipment operation. The 4-gas monitor was simple, a unit about the size of a thick smartphone that clipped to my chest and alarmed at preset thresholds. The self-rescue device was a filter mask in a sealed can that he said would provide about an hour of breathable air in a CO environment, less in a methane environment, and nothing useful in a zero oxygen environment. The key thing was not to let it come to that. "What's the oxygen situation like down there?" I asked. Level 1 was fine in the preliminary inspection. Level 2 had slightly elevated CO2, not dangerous, probably from biological activity in the water. Below that, the inspector didn't go, so I can't tell you. Monitor your instrument and trust it. I said I would. "One more thing," he said, and he paused in a way that made me pay attention. "The lower shaft cap, the one for levels 3 and 4. It's been welded shut. The company decision was that for this initial mapping phase, you work levels 1 and 2 only. If the work there suggests that 3 and 4 are accessible and worth investigating, Aldrich will bring in a specialized team with full confined space certification. So I'm not going below level 2. Correct. There's a physical barrier, so it's not just a rule. You literally can't get down there without cutting equipment. But I wanted to be clear about the scope. He gave me his direct number and the number for the regional mine safety office, told me to call him if anything unusual came up, and was back in his truck and gone by 9:30. I stood there in the October morning, outside the old lamp room with the new equipment laid out on the folding table, and I looked at the mine entrance for a while. The cap was a steel plate set over the top of the shaft collar, with a hinged access door on one side, the kind of thing that could be lifted and secured with a prop rod. Aldrich had added a new padlock to the access door. I found the key in the envelope under the table. I didn't go in that day. I wanted to spend the morning reviewing the maps again and setting up my documentation system, a grid of reference stations on the surface that I could use to tie the underground survey to the GPS coordinate system. This is routine prep work for any mine survey, and it's important to get right at the beginning, because errors in the control network propagate into everything you do afterward. I set 7 surface stations, drove rebar monuments at each one, and shot them all from 2 different instrument setups to get redundant coordinates. The work took most of the day. By 4 o'clock, the light was going that amber sideways color through the oaks, and I decided to call it. I was staying at a motel in Weatherly, about 15 minutes from the site. It was the only motel in town, a 12-room place on the main road that had probably been there since the early 70s and had been maintained with exactly the level of care you'd expect. My room was clean enough, the bed was firm. There was a vending machine in the hallway that dispensed cold coffee in cans, and I used it most mornings. The diner in town did dinner too, not just breakfast, and I ate there 3 or 4 nights a week. The woman who ran it, her name was Dolores, had started recognizing me by the end of the first week and would bring coffee without me asking. She asked what I was doing in town, and I told her I was working out on the old site, the mine. She stopped moving for just a moment. Something shifted in her face, not alarm exactly, more like a slight rearrangement of her expression into something more careful. "The old Kessler mine?" she said. I asked if that was what locals called it. That's what it was. Kessler Brothers Coal, back when, before whoever owned it last. She started moving again, refilling the cup. "You're going down in it?" I said that was the plan. She didn't say anything else about it right then, but when she brought my check, she said, "You keep careful track of where you are down there." I told her that was literally my job. "I know," she said. "I just mean keep careful track." I didn't know what to make of that, so I left her a 20% tip and went back to my room and went to sleep. I went underground for the first time on a Monday, 10 days into the job. I'd done everything I could on the surface, and there was no more reason to delay. I suited up in my trailer, checking the gas monitor, testing the headlamp, going through the safety checklist that Garrett had left with me. The morning was cold, maybe 40 degrees, and the ground around the mine entrance was stiff with a light frost. I unlocked the cap, propped the access door, and sat on the collar rim for a moment, looking down into the shaft. The ladder was new. Aldrich had installed it as part of the preliminary inspection preparation, galvanized steel rungs bolted into the concrete shaft lining, going down about 80 feet to the level 1 station. Below that was a second ladder section for level 2, another 60 feet or so. Below that was the welded cap. The shaft was maybe 10 feet in diameter, round, lined with brick in the upper section, and then transitioning to bare rock lower down. There was a faint smell coming up from it, something mineral and cold, the smell of enclosed earth that hadn't seen open air in decades. Not unpleasant, just old. I turned on my headlamp, clipped the gas monitor to my chest strap, and started down. The descent took about 4 minutes. The rungs were solid, no wobble, and the installation work had been done properly. About halfway down, there was a moment where my headlamp threw my own shadow onto the shaft wall in a way that made the shadow look bigger than me and moving differently, just a trick of the geometry, but my heart rate went up a notch anyway. I kept going. Level 1 was a T-shaped station, the shaft bottom opening into a concrete room about 12 feet square, with 2 tunnel openings on opposite walls. Both tunnels were roughly 7 feet tall and about 5 feet wide, with timber sets framing them at regular intervals. The timbers were old but not failing. The floor was dirt, compacted and dry. There was flagging at the tunnel entrances. The preliminary inspection team had used bright orange plastic tape, 1 strip over the left entrance and 3 strips over the right entrance, which I assumed meant something in their shorthand, but which wasn't explained in any document I had. The junction marker was there too, a small aluminum disc, maybe 2 inches in diameter, on a short length of wire hung from a nail in the concrete above the shaft ladder. Stamped into the disc was the number 1. I checked my map. Junction 1 was the level 1 station. The right tunnel, marked with 3 strips of orange tape, was the main gangway east. The left tunnel was the main gangway west. I spent that first day entirely on the eastern gangway. I set my instrument up at 3 different positions, shot all the visible geometry, documented the condition of the timber sets, measured the tunnel profile. Good work, methodical. At 4 of the lateral junctions off the eastern gangway, I found the aluminum discs in their expected positions, numbers 3, 7, 11, and 14, according to my map, hanging where they should have been, in reasonable agreement with the mapped locations. The only thing that bothered me even slightly was junction 11. According to my map, junction 11 was where a short lateral called the number 4 heading turned off to the south. The disc was there, number 11 in the stamped aluminum, hanging on its wire. But the lateral behind it was longer than the map showed, significantly longer. The map showed about 90 feet of number 4 heading before it ended in what was annotated as worked out face. My laser rangefinder shot down the lateral, returned a reading of about 220 feet before hitting a wall. I noted it in my field book, didn't overthink it. Old maps aren't always precise. There could have been additional development that wasn't recorded, especially in the later years when record keeping had evidently gotten sloppy. I went back to my primary survey. That evening, I organized my field notes at the trailer, transferred the day's measurements to my laptop, and started building the digital model. The eastern gangway was coming together cleanly. Good data. I called Dolores's diner on a whim, found that yes, they did take out, and drove into town for a burger. Dolores handed me the bag across the counter and said, without particular preamble, how was it down there? I told her it was fine. Damp smelling but structurally sound. Did you see anything strange? I thought about junction 11, 220 feet instead of 90. No, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, my father worked in that mine, back before it closed. He was a miner, not management, one of the regular men. I said I was sorry it had closed. Don't be, she said. He was glad to be out. He never talked about it much, but I know he was glad. He used to say the mine had a memory, that it remembered where men had worked and where men had died, and that those places weren't like the other places. She paused. He was a practical man, my father. He wasn't given to that kind of talk. That's why I always remembered it. I thanked her for the burger and drove back to the motel and ate at the small desk in my room, thinking about practical men and what they chose to say. The second week underground was more ambitious. I moved into the western gangway and worked 3 of the laterals there, running a total of about 4,000 feet of tunnel survey. The western side of level 1 was in slightly worse shape than the eastern, more water staining on the walls and ceiling, one section where a timber set had failed and the roof had shed some material. Nothing dangerous, but enough that I photographed it and noted it with a caution flag in my documentation. The markers on the western side were mostly where they should have been, mostly. At junction 8, which was supposed to be at the intersection of the main gangway and the number 7 heading, I found the disc, number 8. But it was hanging on the wrong wall. The junction was a T, the main gangway continuing straight, and the heading turning off to the right. The disc should have been hanging on the right wall, marking the heading entrance, which was the convention I'd seen everywhere else on level 1. Instead, it was hanging on the left wall, on a nail that looked newer than the surrounding rock, the nail head still relatively bright. I stood there for a minute looking at it. Someone had moved it. Sometime after the original installation, Someone had relocated this disc from the right wall to the left wall. I couldn't think of a good operational reason for that. Maybe it had fallen off the original nail, and whoever replaced it had put it back in the wrong spot. That was the most obvious explanation. I moved it back to the right wall, where it belonged, and I made a note in my field book. Junction 8 disc, found on wrong wall, left instead of right, relocated to correct position. I finished the western gangway work and started planning the level 2 descent. The gas readings on level 1 had been fine throughout. Oxygen at or near 21%, CO and methane near 0, CO2 slightly elevated, but well within the safe range. Level 2 was expected to be a little worse, but still workable. The level 2 ladder went down another 60 feet from the level 1 station. Level 2 felt different from level 1 as soon as I got there. The air was heavier, not in a dangerous way. The monitor showed nothing alarming, but there was a perceptible thickness to it, like the air had been sitting still for a long time and had gotten comfortable in place. The smell was stronger too, more complex, mineral and wet, and something else, something faintly organic that I couldn't quite identify. The level 2 station was larger than level 1, a roughly rectangular space where the shaft intersected a wider main gangway. 2 tunnel openings, one on each side, and the junction marker, number 2 on the disc, hanging from its nail. There was also something else. Against the wall of the station, to one side of the shaft ladder, someone had placed a wooden crate. It was old, seriously old, the wood the color of pewter, and it was empty. No markings on the outside. I looked at it for a while. The preliminary inspection report hadn't mentioned a crate. I photographed it and measured its location and moved on. Level 2 work was slower, partly because I was being more careful, partly because the geometry was more complex. The original maps showed the level 2 tunnels as having more lateral galleries and more irregular profiles than level 1. Where the level 1 tunnels were relatively straight and uniform, the level 2 galleries varied more, narrower in some places, wider in others, with occasional alcoves cut into the walls that might have been equipment storage areas or escape bays. Some of the alcoves were empty. A few had remnants of old equipment in them, brackets and hooks, and the rusted remains of what had probably been ventilation ductwork. On my third day on level 2, I found the first real discrepancy. I was working the number 12 heading, a lateral that according to the original map ran about 300 feet to the east before ending at a worked-out coal face. I'd surveyed about 200 feet of it when my headlamp picked up something unexpected, another junction. A T intersection, the lateral continuing forward and a new passage turning off to the right. This passage was not on any map I had. I stopped and checked the laminated safety sheet. The junction markers in this area should have been 15 and 17. I was standing at what should have been 17. There was no marker at the intersection I'd just found, no disc on any wall, just the opening, going off to the right, into dark. I shot it with the rangefinder. The passage returned a reading of 410 feet before the beam hit something. At that distance, the reading could have been a wall, or it could have been something standing in the passage. There was no way to tell from here. I stood there for probably 3 minutes. My gas monitor was fine. The air felt the same as everywhere else on level 2. There was no sound from the passage, which I expected, but I waited and listened anyway. I shone my headlamp into it and could see maybe 40 feet before the beam diffused into general dimness. It didn't smell different from the rest of the tunnel. It looked like a tunnel, which is what it was. I noted it in my field book as unmapped lateral junction, approximate position, passage approximately 410 feet in length, no junction marker present. I did not go in. I was already committed to the number 12 heading for the day's work, and I wanted to finish that before I started exploring unmapped passages. I finished 12, came back out to the level 2 station, ate my lunch there, and radioed Rick through the surface relay to mention what I'd found. The relay was slightly degraded at that depth, but his voice was intelligible. He told me to document it, which I already had, and to include it in my weekly report, which I said I would. "Does it suggest the mapping gaps are bigger than expected?" he asked. I told him I thought it was possible. This was one unmapped lateral, but the number 4 heading discrepancy on level 1 had been bothering me. If both of those were examples of undocumented development, there could be more. "Do what you can," he said. "Just don't go into anything that looks structurally unsound." I told him I wouldn't. That night I sat in the trailer for a while after dark, looking at the old maps under the propane lantern, running my finger along the tunnels. The maps were beautiful, and they were incomplete. Someone had drawn these with care and precision, and then something had happened, maybe at the end, maybe when they knew they were closing, and the record had become fragmentary. The western extension, mentioned in the logs from 1957, the lower heading from 1961, these were real places that real people had worked, and now they existed only as references in logs written by someone who'd expected someone else to understand them. I found myself thinking about the miner who'd drawn these maps. Whether he'd known he was drawing the last record, whether he'd known the mine was running out of time. My ex-wife Karen used to say I got emotionally attached to my data in a way that wasn't healthy. She wasn't wrong, exactly. She was also attaching that observation to an argument about something else, the way people do. But sitting in that trailer in the dark outside a mine that had been closed for 60 years, I thought she had a point. The next morning I went in to work the unmapped lateral. I climbed down to level 2, confirmed my gas readings were good, and walked back to the number 12 heading and the junction I'd found. In the daylight, or rather in the artificial light of my headlamp, I looked more carefully at the junction mouth. The walls were bare rock, not timbered like the main passages. The floor was rougher than the main tunnel floor. This had been a working face at some point, a place where miners were actively cutting coal, and then the work had stopped before it was finished. You could see the drill marks in the walls where the boreholes had been set. I started into it slowly, stopping every 20 feet to set a prism target for the laser survey and to check the gas monitor. The readings stayed flat. The passage was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, which was uncomfortable with my equipment pack but manageable. At 100 feet, I found the first junction marker. It was a disc, like all the others, hung on a wire from a nail. The number stamped on it was 19. I checked my map. Junction 19 was supposed to be at the far end of the number 15 heading, on the other side of the level 2 station from where I was. Not here. I photographed the disc in place, noted the discrepancy, kept going. At 200 feet, the passage widened slightly, and the floor leveled out. At 250 feet, I found another marker. This one was number 22. According to my map, there were only 23 junctions total. Numbers 19 and 22 were both supposed to be in specific locations on the eastern side of level 2. Neither of them should have been in this unmapped passage. I stopped moving. I was in a narrow tunnel that wasn't on any map, with junction markers that had been displaced from their correct positions, 400 feet underground. My gas monitor was reading fine. My radio was showing a weak signal from the level 2 relay. I thought about what Garrett had said. If you feel like you've lost track of where you are, stop moving and retrace. I didn't feel lost. I knew exactly where I was, because I'd been running a continuous survey from the level 2 station. My total position was clear. What I didn't know was why these markers were here instead of where they were supposed to be. I decided to continue to the end of the passage. It was another 160 feet. The passage ended in a rough face, clearly worked out, the coal seam having pinched out. No equipment, no debris, just rock and the smell of old excavation. At the face, hung on a nail I could not have predicted, was another disc, number 15. Junction 15, according to the map, was a location on the eastern main gangway. Not here, not in this passage. 3 markers out of position. In a passage that didn't appear on any map. I photographed everything and went back out. I sat in the level 2 station for 10 minutes, not doing anything useful, just breathing and thinking. The markers were wrong. That was a fact. Why they were wrong was a question. The most sensible explanations were they'd been moved during some late phase of the operation. Maybe a reorganization of the mine that wasn't reflected in the surviving records. Or someone on the preliminary inspection team had moved them, for reasons I couldn't fathom. Or they'd been in these positions all along and the map was simply wrong. None of those explanations bothered me exactly, but the third one bothered me the most, because if the map was wrong about where the markers were, it might be wrong about other things. I documented everything and came out of the mine for the day. I called Garrett that evening from my motel room. His phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message describing what I'd found and asking for any documentation about the marker system, specifically whether anyone had moved or relocated markers since the preliminary inspection. He called back the next morning, just as I was loading up to head to the site. "I'll look into it," he said. "The inspection team wasn't supposed to touch the markers, just document their location. Let me check the inspection report for that section." He called back while I was driving, which was inconvenient. I pulled over on the gravel road to take the call. "So I looked at the inspection notes," he said. "The inspector documented markers 1 through 18. He didn't go into any passage that wasn't on the original map, so markers 19 through 23 aren't in his notes at all. He couldn't have moved them because he didn't find them." "How does he know he documented 1 through 18 if some of them were in the wrong place?" There was a short pause. "He logged them by number as he found them, so he found a marker that said 19 in a place where, according to the map, there shouldn't have been one, and what he did was just note the number and move on." "He didn't flag it as out of position?" "He was doing a structural assessment. The markers weren't really his focus." Another pause. "I'll be honest, this is a little outside what I can resolve on a phone call. Just document what you find, and we'll get someone from the historical records side to look at it." I drove the rest of the way to the site. There is a particular kind of operational discomfort I've learned to recognize over the years. It's not fear, exactly. It's more like the feeling when you've been handed a set of blueprints and you've started to realize they don't match the building, and you can't figure out whether the building is wrong or the blueprints are wrong. The data doesn't align, and you don't know if the problem is in the thing you're measuring or in the reference you're using to measure it. The mine was the building, the maps were the blueprints, and they were not matching. I spent the next 2 days working the mapped portions of Level 2, documenting the tunnels that appeared on my reference sheet and shooting their geometry. The work was steady, and the data was clean. Most of the markers in the mapped area were where they should have been. Numbers 2 through 14 accounted for in positions consistent with the original map, give or take a few feet. The exceptions were numbers 19, 22, and 15, which I'd already found in the unmapped passage, and number 8, which I'd relocated on the western gangway of Level 1. On my second day of that stretch, I noticed something else. I was working the number 9 lateral, a short passage off the eastern side of Level 2, when I came to the end of it, a dead end the map showed as a worked-out face, and I found that the end was not a dead end. The passage continued, not through a collapse, not through some obvious new opening, just continued, past where the map said it should stop, into more tunnel, a section that hadn't been there in the original survey or in the preliminary inspection, as far as I could tell. I stood at the point where the map said the passage should end, about 300 feet from the main gangway, and I looked at the continuation. My rangefinder said it went at least another 300 feet. I noted it and came back out. I sat in my trailer with the maps and my laptop for a long time that afternoon, running numbers and checking reference points. My survey data placed these discovered extensions in consistent geographic positions. They were real, they were there. The question was why they weren't on the map. One possibility: the map was created before this development happened, and the new development was never added to the record. This would mean there was a phase of active mining in these areas that wasn't documented anywhere. Another possibility: the original map was created from incomplete records even at the time of its creation, and these tunnels had always been there but were left off for some reason. A third possibility that I kept setting aside because it was absurd: the tunnels were in different positions than they appeared to be, and what I was measuring didn't match what the map showed because the map showed something that no longer existed in the same form. I kept setting aside the third possibility, because tunnels don't move. They are cut into rock. Rock doesn't shift in ways that would relocate a 300-foot lateral passage. Not in an anthracite mine. Not in 60 years. I went to Dolores's diner that night and ate dinner and didn't mention any of this to her. She refilled my coffee and asked how the work was going, and I said it was complicated, and she said that didn't surprise her. "Did your father ever talk about the layout of the mine?" I asked. "The tunnels, specifically." She thought about it. "Not in detail. He talked about which level he worked on, mostly level 2. That's where the best coal was toward the end. He talked about some of the other men. By name, he talked about the pump." "The pump?" "There was a big pump on the lower level, level 3 or 4, I don't remember which. It was always running, to keep the water out. He used to say that pump was the heart of the mine. When the pump stopped, the mine died. He said that's how it ended. The pump failed and they couldn't keep up with the water, and the owners decided not to fix it." I asked when that was. "Spring of '62, he said. April or May. The mine was flooded by the following winter. That matched the operational log. The last entry, April 9th. Pump maintenance. Then nothing." "He never went back?" I asked. "He never went near it again," she said. "He moved to Hazleton and worked in a hardware store for 20 years and never talked about the mine except those couple of things I told you." I paid my bill and said goodnight. Back at the motel, I reviewed my field notes again. The unmapped extensions, the displaced markers, the gaps in the record. I was building a picture that didn't quite cohere. Each individual piece of evidence was explainable if you were generous with your assumptions. Together, they felt like more than the sum of their parts. The thing I kept coming back to was the markers. If the markers were all out of position, or some of them were, there had to be a reason. They didn't relocate themselves. Someone had put them where they were. The most logical answer was that the markers had been moved during the active mining period, for operational reasons. Mine management sometimes reorganized work areas, reassigned crews, redirected development based on where the coal was and wasn't. When that happened, the reference systems might be updated on the ground, with markers moved to reflect the new organization, without the change being reflected in the official maps. But that would mean the map had been wrong for 60 years, and the preliminary inspector had found the markers without noticing the discrepancy, which meant he hadn't been checking them against the map. And none of that explained the extended passages. Those weren't just annotated differently. They were physically longer than the map showed. Rock. I put away the field notes and watched television for a while and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up at 5:45, which was earlier than I needed to be up, and lay in bed thinking about what to do. The logical thing was to map everything I found, regardless of whether it matched the original maps, and deliver a complete and accurate set of data to Aldrich at the end of the contract. That was, technically, what they were paying me for. The discrepancies were their problem to explain. But there was also a professional responsibility dimension. If the mine had significantly more unmapped tunnels than Aldrich knew about, that was relevant to their safety planning. Not just the development plan, but the actual safety of anyone who went down there. Unmapped voids can affect surface stability. They can contain trapped gas. They can have different structural characteristics than the mapped tunnels. I emailed Rick at 6 in the morning, which I knew was early, but so did he. I laid out what I'd found in clinical terms. 2 extended passages beyond mapped terminations, 3 displaced junction markers in an unmapped lateral, 1 relocated marker on level 1. I told him I thought Aldrich needed to know that the original mapping data was more significantly incomplete than their preliminary assessment had suggested, and that this had implications for the safety protocol. His reply came at 8:48. Aldrich is aware. Continue documentation. Do not go below level 2. That last part was already in my instructions. I didn't know why he felt the need to add it. I went out to the site and spent the morning running the extended portion of the number 9 lateral. It was about 340 feet of additional tunnel, clearly worked, the walls showing the characteristic cleat face pattern of anthracite coal cutting. At the far end there was an alcove, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with a wooden bench along one wall. The bench was intact, the wood gray and dry, the surface worn smooth by use. On the bench were 3 objects: a metal lunchbox, the old half-round kind that hinged at the top, rusted but intact, a single leather glove, stiff with age, and a small notebook, probably 3 inches by 5, bound in what had been some kind of oilskin, but was now just a cracked and darkened covering. I looked at these things for a long time. I photographed them, I put on a pair of latex gloves from my pack and picked up the notebook. The pages were brittle, but most of them were intact. The writing was in pencil, small and close, in a style that looked like it belonged to the 40s or 50s, the letters formed in the way that people wrote when they'd learned to write from a teacher who cared about penmanship. I could make out most of it. It was a personal log. The first entry I could clearly read was dated November 14th, 1960. There was a name at the top of the first page, W. Petrovsky. I flipped through it, getting a rough sense of the contents. It was a working man's diary, irregular entries, mostly noting what he'd worked on, sometimes noting something about the men he worked with, sometimes about conditions in the mine. A few entries mentioned something he called the marker problem and noted that things weren't where they should be, but without elaborating. One entry, dated March 3rd, 1961, stood out. It was longer than most. I photographed it with my phone camera and read it in better light later. Here is roughly what it said. Talk to Sedek about the number 4 area again. He says he hasn't moved anything, and I believe him. Went back to check this morning before shift, and the disc that was on the south wall yesterday was on the north wall. I put a chalk mark on the wall when I left last night, and the chalk mark was on the south wall, and the disc was on the north wall. I am not confused about this. I am not losing my mind, though Sedek seems to think so. Something is wrong in the lower section, and nobody wants to talk about it. I read that twice. Then I photographed everything in the alcove, measured its position in my survey, carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, and came back out of the tunnel. On the ladder up to level 1, I stopped about halfway up and just hung there in the shaft, in the dark, the gas monitor humming its quiet baseline readings. The shaft was cold and still. I was aware, in a way that I rarely am in my work, of how far underground I was. The weight of earth above me, the fact that the air I was breathing had been down here so long it barely moved when you breathed it in and out. I thought about W. Petrovsky, writing in that notebook, watching a disc move from one wall to another. I finished climbing out. I stood in the October cold and took several deep breaths of cold air and looked at the headframe against the gray sky. Then I went into the trailer and called Garrett Huff. He answered on the second ring. I found something in the mine, I said. A personal log belonged to one of the miners. It's documented in my survey. I didn't remove it. Okay, he said cautiously. In the log, the miner writes that he observed a junction marker, changing position between one day and the next. Not over time, overnight. One night it was on one wall. The next morning it was on the other wall. He describes making a chalk mark to confirm it. Silence. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, I said, because I could feel the conversation wanting to go there. I'm saying that the marker displacement I'm observing is not new. It was being observed by people who worked in this mine 60 years ago. That's relevant information. I'll pass it along to Aldrich, Garrett said. There's another thing. The passages I've been finding that extend beyond the mapped terminations. These aren't just documentation errors. We're talking about significant additional development that isn't recorded anywhere in the surviving records. The mine has substantially more tunnels than Aldrich's assessment indicated. How much more? I don't have a final number yet, but I'm thinking at least 20% more linear footage than the existing maps show. Possibly more, if there are similar undocumented extensions on the portions of Level 2 I haven't surveyed yet. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Does this change your timeline? It makes the job bigger. Yeah. I'll talk to Aldrich about a contract extension. He didn't ask any more about the personal log, or about the marker displacement, or about anything that wasn't immediately logistical. I noted that and didn't push. That evening I downloaded the phone photos of the Petrovsky log pages and spent a couple hours reading through what I'd captured. There were about 30 entries in total that were legible enough to transcribe. Most were routine. Equipment notes, complaints about a particular foreman whose name was written with sufficient contempt to be legible across decades, notes about individual seams, what was good and what was giving out. The marker references appeared in several entries, but the March 3rd entry was the most explicit. There were a few others. January 19th, 1961, found 22 in the wrong place again. Told Koval. Koval says leave it. I don't understand why. February 4th, 1961. 3 discs wrong this morning. 8:15, 22. Put them right before shift. February 4th, same date, a second entry, apparently written later. 8 was back where it was. Not where I put it. Where it was this morning. April 5th, 1961. Lower heading is sealed. Nobody will say why. SETEC says it's the gas, but the monitor reads clean. I don't know what to think. April 15th, 1961. Told Kessler about the discs. He listened. He said he'd look into it. He looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his boot. The last entry in the notebook that I could read was dated September 9th, 1961. It said, "Didn't go into the 4 area today. I don't want to go in there anymore. I don't know if that's cowardice or sense." The mine closed the following spring. I didn't know what happened to W. Petrovsky after that, whether he'd found other work, whether he'd stayed in the area, whether his notebook had stayed in that alcove for 60 years undisturbed, or whether someone had brought it down there at some point since. I tried searching his name online, found nothing specific. There were a few Petrovskys in Carbon County records, but no one I could connect to the mine with certainty. I typed up all the log entries I'd transcribed and added them to my documentation file with a note that the original notebook should be retrieved by Aldrich and preserved, as it represented primary historical evidence of the mine's operational period. Then I sat there in my motel room looking at what I'd typed. A miner had observed the junction markers changing positions. He'd tried to tell his supervisors. His supervisors had either dismissed him or declined to engage. The mine had sealed a section it described as gas-affected, but which evidently read clean on the monitors. The mine had closed. The markers had continued to be in wrong positions for 60 years, undisturbed. I am a surveyor. I do not believe in things that cannot be measured, but I had also just read a first-hand account, written 60 years ago by a man I had no reason to distrust, describing the same thing I was finding in my own survey data. The markers were in the wrong places. They had been in the wrong places, at least in some cases, since before 1961. Something had moved them. What moved them was a question I could not answer, and was not sure I should try to. I went to sleep. I did not sleep well. The next morning I called Rick before I left the motel. "I need to talk to you about this job," I said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly. It's more complicated than I thought, and I need to make sure you're setting Aldrich's expectations correctly." I walked him through the documented discrepancies, the extended passages, the displaced markers, the Petrovsky notebook. He listened. When I finished, he said, "You think the mine is bigger than anyone knew?" "Significantly bigger. And I think the junction marker system was already compromised during the operational period. Whatever reference system Aldrich is planning to use, based on the old maps, they need to know that the old maps are substantially unreliable." "Okay, I can work with that. What do you need from me?" "I need to know if there's any additional documentation, any records that might not have been included in the initial packet, internal Aldrich documents, previous owner files, anything from the intermediate ownership period." "I'll ask." "And I need the contract extension that Garrett mentioned. I'm at roughly half the tunnels surveyed, and I've already found enough unmapped development to suggest the job is at least 50% bigger than scoped. Send me a progress report with the specifics, and I'll take it to them." I said I would. I drove out to the site under a low gray sky, the first really cold day since I'd started. The temperature in the mid-30s with a damp wind that made it feel colder. I suited up in the trailer and stood at the mine cap for a moment before going down. The wind moved through the old headframe and made a sound like distant machinery. I went down. I had planned to start on the portions of Level 2 I hadn't yet surveyed, the western laterals. I descended to the Level 2 station and stood at the junction with my headlamp on and my map out. The junction marker was number 2. It was hanging in its place above the shaft ladder, where it had been every time I'd come down to this level. Except, I looked at it more closely. The number 2 disc was hanging on a wire from a nail, the same as always. But the nail was not the original nail. The original nail had been in the concrete block to the left of the shaft ladder. This nail was in the concrete block to the right. The disc had moved. Overnight. I had been in this station probably 15 times over the course of my work. I had checked the marker every time because it was the primary reference point for the level. The nail had always been on the left. This morning, it was on the right. I took a photo. The photo showed the disc on the right nail. I went back through my photo records on my phone and found an earlier photo of the same marker from 9 days ago. In that photo, the disc was on the left nail. There was no question of confusion or faulty memory. The photographic record was clear. I stood there in the cold station air and consciously worked through the rational possibilities. Someone else had come down into the mine and moved the marker. This would require them to have the padlock combination, the key to the access door on the cap, and the motivation to make this specific, subtle change. Garrett had the combination. Aldrich presumably had access to it. But why? The marker had shifted to a new nail on its own. Impossible. As I said, I do not believe in things that cannot be measured, but my measure of this marker said it had moved, and I had no explanation for how. I documented it. I noted the time, the date, the specific change. I photographed it from multiple angles. I measured the distance from the shaft center to both nails. I recorded everything. Then I continued to work. Because the alternative was to go up the ladder and stop working, and I didn't have enough information to justify stopping. The marker was wrong. Everything else seemed fine. I spent the day on the western laterals. 3 passages, about 2,000 linear feet of tunnel. No new extensions beyond the mapped terminations, which was a small relief. 2 displaced markers. Number 16, which was supposed to be at the end of the first western lateral, was instead at the beginning of the second, and number 21, which was not supposed to be on level 2 at all according to the map, was hanging at the far end of the third western lateral. I noted them all. I did not move them. After the marker at the station, I decided I should stop relocating the displaced ones. If they were in the wrong positions according to the maps, but in consistent positions relative to each other, moving them was potentially disrupting a system that was internally coherent, even if it didn't match the original documentation. That was a rationalization, partly. The other part was that I'd read Petrovsky's notebook, and I was aware of how it felt to know something was wrong and not be sure what to do with that knowledge. I came out at 4, changed the padlock as I always did, and drove into town. Dolores was closing up when I came in, an hour earlier than her posted closing time. She said she'd make an exception and feed me if I was quick about it. I ordered a sandwich and coffee and sat at the counter. "I found something today," I said. "I need to tell someone." She looked at me. "In the mine. A marker, a reference disc we use for navigation. It moved overnight, between when I left yesterday and when I came in this morning." Dolores set her coffee pot down. "How do you know it moved?" "Photographs. I have a photo from 9 days ago showing it in one position and a photo from this morning showing it in another." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does the company say?" "I haven't told them yet. I wanted to think about it." "Think about what?" "I considered that, whether it matters for the work." "Does it?" "It matters for understanding the mine. It doesn't necessarily affect the survey data, because I'm not relying on those markers for my survey. I have my own instrument measurements. The markers are secondary references, but they keep moving. Some of them, yes." Dolores refilled my coffee without being asked. "My father said the mine changed on you. Not the rocks, not the structure. He said the mine changed how it presented itself, which tunnel went where." I said, carefully, "That wasn't physically possible." "I know it's not," she said. That's why he didn't say it to many people. She went to the kitchen to get my sandwich, and I sat there thinking about that. The word she'd used was presented. The mind changed how it presented itself, not that the tunnels actually moved, how they presented, which, if you squinted at it, was not entirely different from what I was experiencing. My survey measurements were consistent. The geometry I was measuring was coherent. What wasn't consistent were the reference markers, the labels attached to the geometry. The markers were in the wrong places according to the original documentation, but they might have been in consistent places relative to each other, representing a different organizational system from the original. What if the marker system had been reorganized at some point, reflecting a different understanding of the mine's layout, and that reorganization had never been documented? What if the markers, as they currently existed, were a more accurate map of the mine as it was at closing, not the mine as it was originally planned? And what if something was continuing to update them? I caught myself on that last thought. That way lay a kind of thinking I didn't want to do. I ate my sandwich. I thanked Dolores. I went back to my motel. I sent Rick a detailed progress report with the marker data included. His response at 11:30 that night was 3 sentences. Aldrich acknowledges the documentation discrepancies. Contract extension approved through end of November. Safety protocol remains as defined. No changes. Nothing about the markers. Nothing about the fact that a reference disk had demonstrably moved overnight. I lay in bed for a long time not sleeping, listening to the wind rattle the window frame. On Thursday of that week, I arrived at the mine at my usual time, 7:30, and found the cap unlocked. The padlock was hanging open on the hasp. I had locked it the previous evening. I was certain of this. It was the last thing I did before leaving the site, every single day, lock the cap and check it. I stood there looking at the open padlock for about 30 seconds. Then I looked around the site. Nothing visually disturbed. Leaf fall overnight had scattered leaves across the concrete around the cap, and the pattern of the leaves didn't suggest foot traffic, but it wasn't conclusive either. Leaves land where they land. I called Garrett. He answered, listened, and said he'd check whether anyone from Aldrich had been on the property. He called back 40 minutes later while I was in the trailer drinking coffee and reviewing my notes. Nobody from Aldrich was on the property, he said. Not that I know of. I'm going to change the combination for the gate and the padlock. In the meantime, if anything looks tampered with or disturbed underground, you come out and call me. I said I understood. Are you sure you locked it? He asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. I said I was sure, but I also recognized that I was sure was exactly what someone would say, whether they were sure or whether they were mistaken, so I understood why he'd ask. I went down. Everything in the mine was, as far as I could tell, exactly as I'd left it. Except, at the level 2 station, the wooden crate that had been against the wall when I'd first come down to this level was no longer against the wall. It was now in the center of the floor, directly under the shaft. I had definitely not moved it. I had measured its position on my first day down here, against the north wall, about 4 feet from the shaft collar. It was now in the center of the floor, directly below the midpoint of the shaft opening, about 7 feet from any wall. I photographed it. I measured its new position. I included both measurements in my documentation. The logical explanation was that someone had come down while the cap was unlocked, sometime between when I'd left the previous evening and when I'd arrived that morning. They'd moved the crate, for reasons unknown. The illogical explanations I wasn't going to entertain. I worked the day. I was tense in a way that made my work sloppy, and by afternoon I caught myself making a recording error and had to go back and reshoot a setup I'd already done. I forced myself to slow down, to check each measurement twice, to breathe. When I came out at 4, the padlock was back in place, closed and locked, with a new combination, which Garrett had texted me during the day. I couldn't figure out if that made me feel better or worse. I didn't go into town that evening. I sat in the trailer until it was too cold, and then I drove back to the motel. In my room, I opened my laptop and spent an hour and a half looking up everything I could find about the mine's history. The internet was not particularly helpful. There were a few historical society mentions of Kessler Brothers coal, a brief notice in a 1962 Hazleton newspaper archive about the mine's closure, a genealogy website that listed the names of miners who died in various anthracite operations in the county in the early 20th century. None of the names meant anything to me. I searched for W. Petrovsky, anthracite, Carbon County. Nothing useful. I searched for the mine site itself. Different combinations of terms. I found a local history blog post from about 8 years back that mentioned the Kessler mine in passing, in a piece about the decline of the local coal industry. The author noted that the mine had a reputation among local residents as a place that behaved strangely, which the author attributed to methane gas effects on workers' cognition. The blog post was poorly sourced, and the author seemed more interested in the atmospheric value of the claim than in investigating it. I also found a single reference in a long forum thread about urban exploration in northeastern Pennsylvania to someone who had apparently gotten into the mine about 15 years ago before Aldrich purchased it. The post was short. Went into the Kessler mine in Carbon County last summer. Got turned around down there. Would not recommend. Something wrong with it. No follow-up replies. The thread had moved on to other topics. I shut my laptop. The next morning, I made a decision I'm not sure was the right one, but which felt necessary at the time. I had been mapping only what I was explicitly contracted to map, the areas on levels 1 and 2 that were accessible within my defined safety parameters. I'd been documenting the unexpected extensions and the displaced markers as anomalies, noting them in my records, but not pursuing them systematically. That approach wasn't working anymore. Every day I went down there, I found more things that didn't match the reference data. Spending my days carefully mapping the mapped areas while leaving the unmapped areas as question marks felt increasingly like trying to understand a building by only looking at the parts that were in the blueprints. I needed to map everything, all of level 2, including the unmapped extensions and the passages that didn't appear anywhere in the original documentation. If the mine was bigger than the maps showed, I needed to know by how much and where. I emailed Rick to tell him this was what I was doing. He replied by noon, "Aldrich approves, stay safe." I went back down. Over the next week, I systematically documented everything accessible on level 2. I ran survey traverses into every unmapped passage, every extension, every alcove. I recorded the geometry, the structural condition, the junction markers and their positions. I built a picture. The picture that emerged was strange. The mapped tunnel system, as represented in the original Linen maps, accounted for about 60% of what was actually down there. The remaining 40% was unmapped development, real excavated passages, and the unmapped portion wasn't distributed randomly. It clustered in specific areas: the northern sector of level 2, where the number 9 heading and 2 similar laterals had their extensions, and a central area where several short connecting passages linked what had appeared on the original map to be dead-end laterals, making them part of a continuous loop. The continuous loop was what got me. On the original map, there were 4 passages on the western half of level 2 that each ended independently. In reality, they connected. You could enter the westernmost one and, by following the unmapped connecting passages, come out at the easternmost one, having made a circuit without ever retracing your steps. A loop, about 1,800 feet in total circumference. This was an unusual design for a coal mine, where tunnels are typically driven in directions that follow the coal seam and don't necessarily connect. You could argue this loop was an accident of geology, the coal seam happening to curve in a way that brought these passages into proximity. But it didn't look like an accident. The connecting passages were sized and finished consistently with the main passages. Someone had intended them. I found 6 additional junction markers in the unmapped areas, bringing the total I'd documented to 29, instead of the 23 on the laminated reference sheet. The 6 new ones were all in the double digits but higher than 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, and one that was hard to read, the stamping worn, that I thought was 31. A marker system with 31 or more positions in a mine that the official documentation said had 23. And these additional markers were in consistent locations relative to each other, consistently hung on the wall that seemed most appropriate for their function. Someone had put them there, in a logical arrangement. Someone had known these tunnels existed and had marked them. On the Thursday of that week, 11 days after I'd first noticed the level 2 station marker had moved, I arrived at the mine in the morning and descended to level 2 and found that the junction marker that I'd last seen as number 2, hanging at the station, had changed. Not position, number. The disc hanging there now was stamped with the number 7. I checked my photos. The disc at this location had been number 2 on every previous visit. The disc at junction 7, which was on the eastern gangway about 400 feet away, should have had number 7. I walked to junction 7. The disc there was number 2. They'd been swapped. I leaned against the tunnel wall and looked at the disc that said 2, hanging in the wrong place. The air around me was the same as always, slightly cool and thick, the gas monitor reading clean. The tunnel was quiet. No sounds except the distant drip of water somewhere in the lower workings. 2 discs, in each other's places, each on its own wire, on its own nail. This wasn't a disc that had slid down its wire and fallen and been replaced in the wrong spot. Each disc was properly hung, properly displayed. Each disc was in a position that made sense as a marker position, on the correct wall, at the correct height, visible from the correct approach direction. They were just the wrong numbers. The word that came to me, standing there in the dark tunnel, was curated, like something was curating the marker system, maintaining it, but according to a different scheme than the original. I went back to the station and sat on the crate, which was back against the north wall where I'd first found it, and I thought about this. I had been measuring this mine for going on 3 weeks. In that time, I had found significantly more tunnel footage than the maps showed, more junction markers than the maps accounted for, markers in positions inconsistent with the maps, markers that changed position or changed their apparent number between visits, a closed padlock that was open one morning, a crate that moved and then moved back, a 60-year-old miner's notebook describing the same marker irregularities I was finding. These things were facts. I had documented them. They were in my photos, my field notes, my survey data. What they meant was not a fact. What they meant was a question. I went back to work. I finished the level 2 documentation that afternoon, the last of the unmapped extensions, and in the early afternoon, I climbed down to the junction where the welded cap separated me from levels 3 and 4. The cap was a steel plate, welded across the shaft, no way through without cutting equipment. I looked at it for a while. I shone my headlamp along its edges. There was no gap, no way through, but on the face of the steel plate someone had drawn something, recently, in what looked like chalk. I photographed it. It was a rough schematic, 4 circles connected by lines, like a circuit diagram or a simple map. Inside one of the circles was a number, 31, the same number I thought I'd seen on the worn marker disc in the far extension of level 2. I crouched and looked at this drawing for a long time. The chalk was fresh, white and crisp against the old steel, not weathered, not discolored by the mine air. This had been put here recently. I photographed it from 4 different angles and climbed back out. I didn't sleep well that night. I hadn't been sleeping well most nights. My notes from that period are erratic, half-formed thoughts about measurement and reference systems, about the relationship between maps and the things they mapped, about what it means when the ground doesn't match the record. I called Karen, which surprised me. I didn't usually do that. She picked up, which surprised me more. "I'm on a job in Pennsylvania," I said. "It's a weird one." "How weird?" "I'm mapping an old mine. The maps we started with don't match what's actually down there. Not by a little, by a lot." "That sounds complicated." "Yeah." I didn't say what I was actually thinking, which was that the mine felt like it was doing something, which was irrational and yet was the most accurate description I had. "How are you doing?" She told me. She'd started a new job, was living in an apartment, was seeing someone casually, She sounded better than she had the last time we'd talked, which was several months before. She asked how I was doing, and I told her about the motel and the diner and Dolores's coffee, and she laughed a little at the vending machine part. "You always end up in places like that," she said. "Yeah, Dan." A pause. "Are you actually okay?" I thought about the chalk drawing on the welded cap, the disc that said 7, where the disc that said 2 should have been. "I think so," I said. "I'll know better in a few weeks." She said to take care of myself. I said I would. We hung up, and the room felt very quiet. I went back in the next morning. The chalk drawing on the welded cap was gone. The steel was bare. I checked my photos. The drawing was there in the photos. Clear, unambiguous. Circles and lines, and the number 31. But the steel cap showed nothing. Not even a smudge where the chalk had been. I documented this. I added it to my notes. I measured the cap surface. I came back up. In the trailer, I sat with my laptop and looked at the photo of the drawing again. I zoomed in. The circles were roughly the same size, connected in a specific arrangement. I sketched it on paper and then, rotating my sketch until it oriented differently, I realized what it looked like. It looked like a simplified map of 4 mining levels, viewed from the side. The circles were the levels. The lines were the vertical connections, the shafts and ladders. One level had the number 31 in it, level 4. If you counted the levels from top to bottom, and if the circle with 31 in it was the 4th circle from the top, then whoever had drawn this was indicating that junction marker 31 was on level 4, below the welded cap, below where I was allowed to go. I stared at this conclusion for a while. Then I took a photograph of my sketch and emailed it to Rick with a subject line that said, "Urgent, please review and respond." He didn't respond. I called him. It went to voicemail. I left a message describing the drawing, noting its disappearance, explaining my interpretation. He called back the next afternoon, 26 hours after I'd sent the email. His voice was careful. "The drawing you saw," he said, "are you certain it was chalk, not something that had always been there?" I've photographed that surface several times over the course of the job. It wasn't there before, and it disappeared. Overnight. Another silence. "What do you think it means?" I told him what I'd concluded. Level 4, Junction 31, the worn marker I'd seen in the deepest part of the Level 2 extension. "Dan," he said, and his voice shifted into something more personal, less professional. "This job, is it getting to you?" I said I didn't think so. "Because the things you're describing, they're strange. I believe you're documenting them accurately. But what you're describing is beyond the scope of the contract and beyond my ability to explain, and I want to make sure you're doing okay." I said I was doing the work and I was okay, and what I needed from him was to tell Aldrich what I'd found and get someone to explain the chalk drawing. "Aldrich has been notified of everything in your reports," he said. "Their position is that the documentation discrepancies are attributable to the incomplete nature of the original records, and that the physical anomalies are likely explained by occasional access by local individuals to the site prior to their ownership. Someone drawing an accurate schematic of the mine's level layout in chalk on the inside of a sealed shaft cap. They don't have an explanation for that specific item. No. Dan, the contract runs through end of November. That's 3 more weeks. Can you complete the work?" I thought about it. The mine didn't frighten me, exactly. It unsettled me. There was a difference. Unsettling was something I could work through. "I can complete it," I said. "Good. I want it on record that I think Aldrich should bring in someone to evaluate levels 3 and 4 before they do any development planning. The chalk diagram, the marker 31, the reference to the lower heading in the Petrovsky notebook. There are indications of significant unmapped development below the welded cap. I'll note that in the file. I mean, bring someone in who can actually assess it, a mine safety engineer, not just a reviewer. I'll recommend that to Aldrich." I didn't believe he would, but I'd said it. The last 3 weeks of the job were methodical, almost tedious in places, which I was grateful for. I completed the full survey of Level 2, including all the unmapped extensions, and produced a clean digital map of what I'd found. The total documented tunnel footage on Level 2 was about 40% more than the original maps had shown. The junction marker count was 29 clearly documented positions, plus the possibly 31 one in the deep extension. Every morning when I descended to Level 2, I noted the positions of the junction markers. Most days they were unchanged from the previous visit, but on 4 occasions during that 3-week period, I found a marker in a position different from the previous day. Each time I documented the discrepancy without moving the marker. Each time the gas readings were fine and there was no other physical evidence of disturbance. On one of those mornings, I found that 2 markers had been swapped during the night, and that a third, number 26, which I'd last seen in a specific alcove on the northern extension, was now hanging at the entrance to the loop system on the western side. This was not a small relocation. The alcove and the loop entrance were about 800 feet apart and required passing through several junction intersections to get from one to the other. Something had moved a marker 800 feet through underground tunnels overnight. I documented it. I went to work. Twice during those final weeks, I heard sounds from below the welded cap. Both times I was at the bottom of the Level 2 shaft, close to the cap, shooting measurements in that area. The sounds were not dramatic. The first time it was a rhythmic vibration, felt more than heard, that lasted about 30 seconds and then stopped. I thought briefly of the pump that Dolores's father had talked about, the pump that had been the heart of the mine. But that pump was decades gone, flooded out in 1962. The second time was a sound I described in my field notes as a distant metallic tapping, irregular pattern, possibly structural settling or water pipe resonance. 5 taps, roughly, then silence, then 3 more, then nothing. I am not going to make a claim about what that sound was. It was a sound in a mine. Mines make sounds. Old structures settle and expand and contract with temperature. Water moving through rock makes sounds. I heard a sound. I documented it. I do not know what caused it. On my last full day in the mine, the day before I was scheduled to wrap up and deliver my final report, I descended to Level 2 and did a final walk of the entire documented system. I wanted to check that my notes matched what I saw, that the geometry was right, that the marker positions I'd recorded were accurate for the final documentation, a quality control pass. I walked the eastern gangway first, then the loop system, then the northern extensions. Everything was consistent with my most recent notes. At the end of the deepest extension, the one where I'd found the worn marker that might have been number 31, I stopped. The passage ended in a rough face, the usual worked-out terminus. I looked at the face for a minute. The marker disc was not there. I checked my notes. On my previous visit to this location, the disc had been on the right wall, about 5 feet from the face, hung on a wire from a crack in the rock, where no nail had been necessary. The crack was still there. The wire was still there. The disc was gone. I shone my headlamp around. No disc on any other wall. No disc on the floor. The wire was there, end still in the crack, the other end trailing a few inches with the bend in it where the disc had hung. The disc had been removed. I photographed everything. I measured the location. I noted the absence. Then I came back out. I spent the evening in the trailer writing up the final report, which took until nearly midnight. The report was thorough. It documented everything: the extended passages, the marker discrepancies, the physical anomalies, the Petrovsky notebook, the chalk drawing, the sounds. All of it was in there, with the appropriate photograph references and field note citations. In the conclusions section I wrote, "The tunnel system as documented herein is substantially larger than indicated by the reference maps provided for this project. The junction marker system does not correspond to the original reference map and appears to reflect a reorganization of the underground space that is not documented in any surviving records. The nature and cause of this reorganization and of the ongoing positional variations in the marker system observed during the survey period are outside the scope of this survey and warrant further investigation. Aldrich Resources should treat the maps provided herewith as the best current representation of levels 1 and 2, while acknowledging that conditions below level 2 are unknown. I thought about whether to include that last sentence. It felt presumptuous, but it also felt true. I left it in. I emailed the report to Rick and Garrett at midnight and went back to my motel for the last time. I packed my gear. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. In the morning, I drove out to the site one last time to collect my tools from the trailer. The morning was clear, the first clear day in a while, cold and bright, the oak leaves mostly down by now, the birches still holding a few yellowed leaves. The head frame was dark against the sky. I stood and looked at it for a while, at the old sheave wheel at the top, the rusted iron turning slowly in the wind. I loaded my truck. I took down the survey monuments I'd set on the surface, leaving the rebar in the ground, collecting the caps and screws. Standard practice, leaving nothing that a subsequent survey would have to account for. Before I left, I went to the mine cap and looked at it. The padlock was in place. I had the key, but nothing was making me use it. I thought about W. Petrovsky, sitting in that alcove with his notebook, writing about a disc that moved from one wall to another. A practical man, he was a practical man, who had watched the mine's reference system rearrange itself and hadn't known what to make of it either. I thought about the marker that had been in the deepest extension and was now gone. Where had it gone? I thought about the drawing on the welded cap, level 4, junction 31, and the way the drawing had been there in my photographs and gone the next morning. I thought about the sounds. I did not have answers to these things. I had measurements, and the measurements were accurate, and they did not explain what the mine was doing, because mines don't do things. They're excavated spaces in rock. They exist in the way that geology exists, passively, subject to the physical forces that act on them. But this one had moving markers. This one had tunnels that weren't on the maps. This one had a miner who'd sat in an alcove 60 years ago and written, I don't know if that's cowardice or sense, about not wanting to go into a specific passage. And now the marker from that passage was gone. I got in my truck and drove. I've thought about this job a lot since then. I moved from contractor work to the GIS desk position about 8 months later, which is where I've been since, which is comfortable and well lit and does not involve going underground. I tell myself that's just where my career went, which is true. I submitted my report and got paid, and Rick sent me a Christmas card that year, which was unusually personal for him, and the card said nothing about the mine. I did look up what happened to the Aldrich project about a year later. There's a public notice system for mining operations in Pennsylvania, and Aldrich had filed for a development permit. The permit had been denied. The reason given was inadequate geological characterization of the site, specifically significant uncertainties in the subsurface mapping data. The denial was brief and bureaucratic. I don't know what those uncertainties were. My report was the subsurface mapping data. I'd characterized the mine as thoroughly as I could and noted that levels 3 and 4 were unknown. If the permit was denied on that basis, then either the regulatory agency had concerns about what might be down there, or Aldrich had found something in the additional investigation that raised new questions, or someone had looked at what I documented and decided they didn't want to go further. All of those seem plausible to me. I never found out what happened to the notebook, whether Aldrich sent someone to retrieve it, whether it's still in that alcove with the bench and the lunchbox and the single leather glove. I think about that sometimes. The thing that stays with me most isn't the moving markers or the unexplained sounds, or even the chalk drawing that disappeared. It's a smaller thing. On my very last day in the mine, the quality control walk, when I was going through the eastern gangway, I noticed that junction marker 7, which had briefly been swapped with marker 2 a couple of weeks before, was back in its correct position. The disc that said 7 was back at the junction labeled 7 on the original map. But marker 2, which should have been at the level 2 station, was not at the level 2 station. The disc there said something I hadn't seen before, a number I didn't recognize, something in the high 20s or low 30s, the stamping partially obscured by what looked like a light coating of the mineral deposits that form on metal surfaces over long periods of contact with mine air. The coating was thin but established. not recent. Which meant one of two things. Either the disk I'd been seeing at the station, the one labeled 2, hadn't been there long enough to accumulate the deposits that the other disks had, meaning it was newer than the others, meaning someone had put it there during the survey period, meaning the disk I thought was the original was not original. Or the disk I was seeing now, the obscured high number, was older and had accumulated more deposits. It had been elsewhere and had been relocated to the station, and the number 2 disk had been somewhere that protected it from the deposits, an alcove or an enclosed space, and had been brought out and hung at the station at some point. Both possibilities require someone to have been in the mine during the survey period, moving markers around, or something to have been moving them. I have the documentation, I have the photographs, I have the survey data. All of it is in a file on a hard drive in my home office, and I look at it sometimes, the way you look at something you can't put down and can't quite explain. The mine is still there. The permit was denied, but the property hasn't changed hands again, as far as I know. Aldrich still owns it. The cap is still on the shaft. Whatever's below the welded plate on level 2 is still down there, in the dark, in the water, where the pump failed in 1962 and the mine flooded, and whatever was happening in the lower heading was sealed up and left. I have wondered, occasionally, whether the marker that was in the deepest part of the level 2 extension, the one that was gone on my final day, the one that might have been number 31, is down there now, on level 4, where the chalk diagram suggested it belonged. I have wondered whether everything the mine has been doing with those markers, for the past 60 years or longer, is a kind of indexing, the way you'd organize a filing system. Everything in its proper place, the place that reflects not the original plan, but the current reality. A mine that knows more about itself than the maps do, and that has been quietly correcting the record. I don't know. I don't know what I believe about any of it. I'm a surveyor. My job was to measure what's there, not to explain it. What's there is more than anyone knew. The measurements are accurate.